Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Ferguson. I am the Marketing Campaign Manager for webinars here at Barracuda. Thank you for joining us today for Spear Phishing Top Threats and Trends Volume 4 with Alessia Klevchuk, Senior Product Marketing Manager, and Neil Shaw, Software Engineering Specialist. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please note that this webinar will be recorded, and you will receive a copy of the recording about this time tomorrow. We welcome and encourage audience participation. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box. If we don't get to them right away, don't worry, we will take time to answer all of your questions at the end of the presentation. We also value your feedback, so please take a minute to fill out the survey on your console before logging off today. Lastly, if you are interested in any previous or upcoming webinars, please visit our event page at barracuda.com. And now I will turn it over to Alessia and Neil.
Thanks, Erin, and good morning or afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you very much for taking time to join us to hear about our latest research into spear phishing and how attackers' activities, the type of attackers' activities we see in compromised accounts. So email today is the most important communication tool, probably, especially now when so many of us are remote. This is one of the channels that we use to communicate with our colleagues, with our partners, with our customers. And it's not only an important communication tool for us, it's also a very important tool for hackers to use to try to get inside organizations. Email-borne threat is really an existential threat, and we've built a number of protections against potential hacks and potential fraud that comes through the email. However, not all of those protections work against all of the different types of threats. So we want to ask you a question: how will you secure more than just your gateway? And today we want to focus on specifically on account takeover types of attacks where technologies like email gateways don't always work, and we will examine the reasons why and dive into kind of the details of account takeover itself. You know, because email is such an important communication tool, it continues to be the most common vector for breaches as well. 96% of attacks starts with email. A very large proportion of them actually will have some form of social engineering used to get into users' accounts, inside the organization. And because spear phishing and social engineering attacks are so prevalent and so impactful on businesses today, we have, over the past couple of years, we've invested in researching different types of spear phishing attacks, and on quarterly basis, or about 2-3 times a year, we publish a report called Spear Phishing Top Threats and Trends. A few weeks ago, we came up with the latest version of that, which is focusing on account takeover, and specifically on the type of activities that we've seen in the attackers do while they are inside the accounts themselves. So we will encourage you to, after this webinar, to download the report, where you'll be able to find a lot more details about account takeover and various activities that hackers do while they're inside their accounts. If you look at your resources tab, you'll be able to see the link to this report, and you can always find all the other reports that we have published on Barracuda website. So before I kind of pass it off to Neil to talk about different, the actual research and the findings of the research, I want to take a few moments to introduce the concept of account takeover. So what is the account takeover and how it works? When we look at the account takeover, we really we kind of define it into 4 different steps and 4 different stages that we have seen. Hackers will infiltrate an organization. They will spend some time learning about the organization and harvesting additional credentials, and then before they try to monetize on their attack. So when it comes to step 1, which is the infiltration part, this is the stage in which hackers are spending time trying to take over the actual account. They're trying to get hold of compromised credentials, either through various phishing attacks or already using kind of data that they buy through database breaches that's happened in the past. And when it comes to the actual phishing attacks, very often what hackers they will use an impersonation attack, trying to impersonate a service such as Office 365, for example, asking you to check your account details, inform you of a security breach, for example, and take you to a website that resembles a login page for your Office 365 accounts, and looks very much like an Office 365 page. An individual will enter their credentials, and they won't be taken to their accounts, but rather their account details and their passwords will be going to the hackers. So once they have infiltrated their account and they're inside the account, what we find is that a lot of the time they don't actually start acting right away. A lot of the time, attackers will spend time inside the account, watching, learning, collecting information about the compromised accounts. They might even try to discover who any business deals in flights, that they might to insert themselves at the right time to increase the potential reward that they can have from these accounts. They will also research for any other valuable accounts and any other valuable individuals within the organization, and see if they can use already compromised accounts to launch additional attacks to harvest additional credentials that might be a little bit more valuable. So that takes a quite considerable amount of time and effort for the hackers, and only after that they start looking to launch additional internal and external attacks, and those could take various forms. They could look to distribute malware, commit wire fraud, or use other social engineering tactics to trick the victims. If you think about account takeovers, it's a really difficult attack to stop and especially detect once it's in progress. Because this attack happens inside the organization. A lot of organizations build security kind of at the perimeter, but in the forms of the gateways that filter emails that comes in and out. However, when you think about the account takeover and everything that happens inside the organization, and it's using a legitimate account. So most of the protections that are being put in place in the forms of gateways and the filtering technologies are really not able to help here, because none of these emails will be going through, especially if it's an internal attack, going through those gateways and filters. So right now, we'll be interested that what the account takeover looks like. I'd be interested if your organization has experienced an account takeover attack. Take time to respond. If it's yes, no, you might not be sure whether or not that happens. So has your organization experienced an account takeover recently? We see some organizations have had an issue with that, and others might have not. Some organizations might have had experienced an account takeover, but not even being aware that that's what's happened. So I'll give you another moment, and then let's take a look at the responses. Okay, so 35% of you think that, almost 36% that you have experienced, and the 57% have not. If you think about it, just almost one in three organizations have experienced account takeover. That's a pretty significant amount. And if you think about the kind of damage that can be done through the account takeover, that's a significant threat that organizations need to pay attention to. So when it comes to actual account attackers' activity, it's relatively straightforward, or there are tools that exist for us to identify the attempts to infiltrate the accounts, as well as when the actual accounts are being used for actual attacks to monetize on that. And there's a lot of research and data that exists that looks at those, like step 1 and the step 4 of account takeovers. But it's the reconnaissance stage and the harvesting of the credentials. What happens while account is takeover, between the times when it was infiltrated, but before the actual attacks are being launched? What happens during that time is those are the questions that are really difficult to answer, and that's the questions that our research was looking at. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Neil to take you through what are the attacker's activities inside the compromised accounts.
Okay, thanks very much, Alicia, and thanks, Aaron, for the introduction. So my name is Neil, and today I'm going to be kind of giving an in-depth overview on some of the research that we did here at Barracuda Networks to really help illustrate and address many of the concerns that Alicia raised, really in regards to kind of attackers and enterprise accounts, and really address a lot of the things that we saw in the poll question, where 1 in 3 organizations are experiencing APO. So kind of the work that we're going to be presenting today really tries to understand attacker activity within these enterprise accounts and tries to understand kind of key things about the life cycle of attack. So kind of to start off with, let me kind of give a high-level overview of the data set we use and kind of the data that we interact with. So as stated, right, our goal was to really understand and examine the end-to-end life cycle of compromised enterprise accounts. So kind of throughout the study, we were able to study this attacker activity within 111 real-world organizations, all of whom are actually Barracuda's customers. So in addition to these kind of 111 organizations, we obtained a set of 159 compromised enterprise accounts across these organizations. So each one of these enterprise accounts, the 159, were actually flagged at least once by Barracuda's kind of machine learning detectors, and also confirmed to be compromised by each organization's IT teams. So we knew these accounts were compromised, and it gave us an ability to go back and study kind of how attackers are operating within these accounts. In addition, for each of these accounts, we also were able to collect data over 3 months in the form of Office 365 login events. So every time a user logs into their account, we're able to collect data and try to understand kind of attacker activity from that point of view. So kind of just as a quick kind of foray before I go into the key findings. So because this study was more of kind of a forensic analysis, so we had accounts that have already been compromised, we faced some challenges that we needed to solve, being able to go back and study this attacker activity after the accounts were compromised. So firstly, kind of the first big challenge was we didn't know for sure when the account was initially compromised, right? So all we knew was that this account was confirmed to be compromised by each organization's IT teams, but we didn't know the precise time at which this account was compromised. So we kind of used this kind of compromise confirmation. So when the organization's IT teams confirmed to be compromised, when these accounts were confirmed to be compromised, we used this time as kind of a proxy as like a best guess, a starting point as to which kind of we saw this first sign of compromise within these accounts. And we then proceeded to collect data kind of before and after this time range to kind of use to understand the attacker activity. And the second kind of big challenge we had was usually when an attacker compromises these accounts, there's going to be a blend of account activity that's kind of attributable to the true user as well as the attacker. So we had to find a way, we had to devise kind of a way to separate out the activity from the true user and the attacker. So one of the big reasons why we collected this large amounts of data kind of over this 3-month window was to help us kind of devise a way to kind of tease out what the attacker activity is and what the true user activity is, kind of trying to understand what is the typical patterns of the true user. And if we see kind of patterns that deviate from the true user's login characteristics, we're more likely to say that those are suspicious. So let's go on to kind of the first big finding that we found as a result of our research. So one of the big questions we tried to explore was to determine ways in which kind of these enterprise accounts can be compromised. So using data from a third-party data breach provider, we actually found that nearly 20% of these enterprise accounts within our study actually appeared in at least one online password data breach. So this was very surprising to us because it not only highlights really the looming threat of data breaches, but it also illustrates, right, the potential problem of password reuse between personal and enterprise accounts. And as a result, it's very important that organizations continue to train employees on the importance of password management and the dangers of password reuse. And in addition, when an account gets compromised through like a data breach, for example, versus like a phishing attack, if organizations have these detectors that are monitoring in real time or monitoring continuous activity and monitoring continuous emails, if an account is compromised via data breach, those detectors would not be able to detect those, given that maybe no email was even sent and an attacker is still able to compromise the account. It highlights the importance of having different types of security mechanisms that are operating on the perimeter to really defend against these kind of attacks. So before we move on, I'm going to throw out a poll question, and you guys, you can actually respond directly on the presentation itself. So this poll question is: how many accounts do you think remain compromised longer than 24 hours? So is it 7%, 25%, 51%, or 87%? So I'll give you guys a few moments, and just out of curiosity, Alicia, what do you think? How many accounts do you think remain compromised longer than 24 hours?
I think it will be probably a pretty significant number.
Yeah. Let's see. So give everyone a few more minutes, and then a few more moments, and then let's go look at the results. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so we see that, yeah, so a majority of you think 87% are compromised for longer than 24 hours, and we also have a good proportion with 51%. Yeah, so what we found is, as kind of part of this second finding from our research, is we actually found that 49% of the accounts are actually compromised less than 24 hours. And surprisingly, as most of you already kind of polled, was more than nearly 51% of accounts were actually compromised longer than 24 hours. And that's pretty scary, given that an attacker is kind of operating in these accounts for a long period of time. And even if we go even past the 1 day mark, even 37% of attackers we found actually are active in these accounts for at least 1 week as well. So we see that there's kind of this variety of time that attackers are active in these accounts. And what kind of a big finding that we found in the takeaway was, if you have like real-time detection that operates kind of continuously before a compromise, that is extremely useful. But we also found that even non-real-time detection, so if you have non-real-time detection kind of monitoring after this initial compromise, this type of detection and security mechanism can still really provide value and prevent significant damage from occurring, given that attackers are really operating in these accounts for long periods of time. So if you have like a detector that's able to monitor over a longer time horizon and kind of monitor this continuous activity, it can still prevent a lot of the damage from occurring. So kind of one avenue that we were also very interested in looking at was trying to set out to explore kind of the different ways and understand the different ways and types of attackers that are really going after these accounts. So we actually found evidence that in 50% of the accounts within our data set, the same attacker likely compromises as well as uses these accounts. So you have the same attacker who goes in, kind of compromises and infiltrates the accounts, as kind of Alicia was referring to in the very beginning, and as well as the same attacker actually extracting value from the account. So within these accounts, we saw kind of these accounts, these 50% of the accounts experience kind of shorter duration times of attacker activity, as well as like kind of small time gaps between the attacker activity. So really, it's just the same attacker that we see that is operating in these accounts. And kind of the more surprising is in 31% of the accounts, we saw evidence that likely one attacker really compromises these accounts, and then another attacker, a different attacker, is actually going in and extracting value and information from these accounts. So there's kind of two things that this highlights. We see that there is some sort of like specialization going on, where some attackers are kind of specializing in compromising the accounts, and others are specializing in really extracting value and information. So one thing we kind of did was, one thing we did to kind of gain evidence for this was in these kind of 31% of the accounts in which we saw evidence for this, we saw that these accounts were compromised for long periods of time. And we also saw that there were large time gaps between kind of successive attacker activity where there was nothing going on in the accounts. So kind of these large time gaps we hypothesize are actually being used to, and in some sense for the attacker who compromised the account to actually go ahead and transfer the credentials to the account to the kind of the second set of attackers that actually go ahead and extract value and information from the account. So that's kind of a takeaway that we saw from these types of attackers. And kind of the last kind of big result that we found from our study was, now really given that these enterprise accounts have access to many of the Office 365 cloud applications, one thing we set out to explore was, are attackers really using them? So are attackers kind of using and leveraging the abundance of information in these cloud applications? And really one of the big surprises that we found was that 78% of attackers in our data set actually only use the email application. So 78% didn't really venture out to kind of exploring the other cloud applications and really only stuck with the email applications. And kind of one reason likely that this could have happened is email is really kind of like a central location, right, for an abundance of enterprise information. So you have like your contacts list, you have kind of all the email messages that are coming in, which are also very, very sensitive. So attackers currently seem to be gaining kind of all the information they need from the email. Right? The emails are in some sense sufficient for kind of extracting the information that they need, or really valuing the account and transferring those accounts to other attackers. And another reason is maybe attackers are also kind of have yet to adapted to kind of exploit these additional cloud applications. So these other cloud applications, they may take a little bit more time for navigating kind of the interface and the UI for an attacker, and attackers have yet to kind of exploit these cloud applications. So the last thing I kind of want to touch upon is, throughout our study, we did see some signs of attackers evading detection. And I guess this is just very useful information for kind of understanding like how attackers are going into accounts and really trying to kind of mask their use of the account and blend in. So we saw some evidence of attackers really blending in kind of with this benign traffic, with the true user, right? So as I mentioned before, when an attacker kind of compromises these accounts, there's going to be a mix of activity from the attacker and the true user. So we saw evidence of attackers really blending in. So kind of the first kind of big thing we saw was in kind of a previous study done at Barracuda, we actually found that kind of within these enterprise accounts, attackers are really operating at normal work hours. So this kind of chart here illustrates kind of the number of phishing incidents per day. And we actually see that during the normal working hours of Monday through Friday, as well as kind of the normal operating hours, maybe like a 9-to-5 schedule that someone's working, that's when we see a lot of the phishing incidents take place. Right? So as an attacker is kind of using this time that a user's usually on, as well as kind of when most employees are on, and kind of using that time to kind of launch a lot of their phishing attacks. And kind of blend in with a lot of the emails that an employee typically receives kind of during this normal working hours. Another interesting thing we found during our study was attackers only, when attackers compromise these accounts, they only change the user password in only 2% of the accounts. So that makes sense from an attacker's perspective, given that they wouldn't want to kind of give away that they're within an account by changing a password, because if they change the password, the user ever tries to log in, they're going to wonder why their password has been changed. So from an attacker's point of view, they wouldn't want to kind of give away that they compromised the account. And kind of the last kind of evasion strategy we saw was that when an attacker logs into their account, a lot of the attackers tend to use the same geolocation. So they tend to log in from the same city, using an IP address from like the same city or the same state as when the true user logs in from. So they try to mask in with kind of avoiding this benign traffic, and try to evade a lot of the detectors that kind of flag on kind of suspicious behavior or out of the ordinary if there's like a completely new location that they've logged in from. So now I'm going to give it back to Alicia, who's going to talk about how organizations can actually protect against these ETOs.
Thanks, Neil. So I want to talk about a little bit what is it that you can actually do to protect against account takeover, how you can detect them, how you can prevent them from happening, as well as if it does happen, how can you, what strategies you can put in place to identify any suspicious activity within your accounts. But before we dive into, I have a question for you. What do you currently do to protect your organization and your users from account takeover? There could be a number of things that you do. You might be focusing on your people, on your employees, using user security training to help them be aware of potential threats of account takeover, how to identify them, what to do, how to report, things to look out for. You might have various policies in place as well. Or you might be focusing on technology. You have this dedicated account takeover protection that monitors for suspicious behavior and flags it for you. You might have a combination of both, or maybe none at all. So I'll be interested to know which ones of those that you use. Do you focus on your people? Do you focus on technology? Is it both? Is it none of the above? Neil, what do you think are the best practices? Where do you think people should be focusing?
I think it's very important to probably focus on the people user training as well as technology. So kind of employing this kind of defense in depth idea where you kind of defend and have security mechanisms at kind of all levels of your enterprise.
Yeah, I think for sure having both is probably the best way forward. But let's have a look what you do. Okay, well, almost half of you are focusing on both people and technology, but between those two, there's about 34% that just focusing on user training. So, as we talked about the two areas to focus, there are people, there are technology, and you really need both to be able to kind of have the best type of protection you can against account takeover and ability to protect your users and your organizations. So when it comes to people, there are a number of things that you can put in place to make sure that you are as protected as you can be. First is monitor and limit access account privileges. So who is within your organization has a privileged access? Do you have a policy set up that monitors that? Do you have a specific individuals that are accessing very sensitive data, or does everybody within the organization is able to access that data? So monitoring the privileged account access can really limit potential exposure of that sensitive information and limit if you do have an attack inside the organization. There's only very few ways that attackers can get to that sensitive information. User security training is always very important. We train our users to recognize phishing attacks, and that should be part of our account takeover protection training, of how to recognize those attacks at the infiltration stage of their accounts. But we also want to train our users to recognize any suspicious activities that might be happening within their accounts as they're using it. Do you find an odd messages in your sent inbox? Do you get out of office replies from people you've never sent emails to? Things like that people need to kind of watch out for, and if it is suspicious, kind of either report or investigate and think about it. Password management is a big thing. Do you train your users on best practices of password management? Neil talked about that the very significant number of account takeovers takes place because people reuse their passwords from the personal accounts and they transfer them onto the business accounts. So making sure that they understand the need to use a unique passwords for different accounts and the best practices around that is very important. And then finally, storage and sharing of confidential data. Where do your employees store that sensitive data? Neil showed how a vast majority of hackers don't go further than users' inboxes. And the reason why they do that is because they have everything they need within the inbox. So is there a different place where you can store the data, the confidential data, and have additional policies in place when that data needs to be shared, so it's not stored in a place where attackers can easily access it? On the other hand, you have a technology. So investing in people is important, but you need to be able to detect those attacks fast, so you can prevent any damage that they could do. So automated account takeover detection is one way to do that. You can deploy the AI technology to monitor things like senders' behavior, looks for very suspicious links, where there's where do users access their accounts, so IP logins, forwarding rules. The AI can really understand if there is something abnormal happens in terms of the activity within the account and flag those abnormalities as potential threats, and identify suspicious behavior and identify account takeovers and hackers already within the accounts. And once you've identified those suspicious behaviors, once you identify the attackers inside the organization, it's very important to react to that as quickly as possible. So to continue monitoring those internal accounts and your ability to remediate those accounts as quickly as possible can really help to prevent further spread of attacks across the organization, and helps you to limit the damage that these account takeovers can help. And then finally, password management and two-factor authentication is very important technologies to have in place. So once we educate our users about password creation and dangers of the reuse of the passwords, and on the other hand, we want to enable two-factor authentication to help prevent hackers from logging into compromised accounts, or introduce that as an additional barrier to prevent hackers from logging into their accounts. So at Barracuda, we build a total email protection that helps organizations to protect their accounts, to protect their users, to protect the businesses. We build a full stack of protection that we believe will provide the best protection when it comes to your email environment. We invested heavily in our gateway technologies to help filter inbound and outbound mail, as well as building a resiliency layer for you to back up your data, to ensure business continuity and access to email during the downtime. And all of that is delivered through the Barracuda Essentials. Barracuda Sentinel is where our account takeover protection lies. It's an AI-enabled technology where we directly link with your Office 365 environment. We have access to the data from your users' inboxes, and we use that data to train our AI to recognize abnormal behavior based on historical and internal communications your users do, and flag any suspicious behavior, whether that's a suspicious email being sent, and we use a similar technology to flag suspicious behavior within email accounts, and therefore identify account takeover. As I mentioned before, people are a very important part of your email security, so training users in security awareness and training users to be able to identify the spear phishing attacks, as well as ability to report them to your IT teams, to your security teams is very important in expediting kind of your response to these attacks that might have gotten through. You can use Barracuda Fishline for that. And then we also have tools, forensics and incident response tools, that will help you to respond quickly to any of the attacks that have been reported to your IT departments, to kind of help them save time to identify all the potential accounts that's been impacted and users that have been impacted by an attack, and remediate as quickly as possible. So with that, I want to take a moment to see if there are any questions. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and Neil and I will talk through those responses. You can also look at the resources tab. As I mentioned before, there is a link to the full report that you will find with a lot more details about the research, as well as advice on what you can do to help you protect against account takeover. So I'll give you a moment to add some questions, and then Neil and I will take some of those. So there's one that I can see that came in. You said the majority of compromised accounts were not used in email attacks. What were they used for?
So yeah, I can take that. So yeah, we saw that a majority of them were not used in email attacks, but at the same time, there are many things that attackers can use these accounts for aside from email. So as Alicia was mentioning with reconnaissance in the beginning, that's like reconnaissance is kind of a big thing that attackers. One of the attackers are really interested in, kind of when they go into these email accounts, just looking around and trying to gather any sensitive or even financial information from these accounts, which is useful for them. A lot of attackers compromise these accounts and eventually go ahead and turn them around and sell them to other attackers. So they need a way to kind of value these accounts, and looking through the emails and valuing the context and which type of email account is it as well is really useful. Kind of another way that attackers are kind of using these accounts is through something called basically conversation hijacking. So at a high level, what conversation hijacking is an attacker will basically set up kind of impersonate kind of their own like email domain. And what they will do is they will basically forward kind of all the conversation going on in kind of these compromised accounts to kind of this outsider like fake domain, fake email account. So that way they can kind of look through these emails kind of outside the user's account. And also at the same time, they can kind of limit the exposure within the user's account to kind of evade kind of detection. But at the same time, they can kind of look through the emails and they can kind of look through any conversations going on and try to kind of engage the user in performing some sort of like money transfer, kind of some sort of like a wire fraud. So we've seen some evidence of that as well. So kind of the big ways that attackers will use these accounts is for some sort of reconnaissance, where they're gaining information kind of to value the account or trying to get information directly out of the user.
I've got another question. Thanks, Neil. I've got another question here. What are your thoughts on Microsoft no longer recommending that passwords change periodically? Should we adopt that policy? Neil, do you have a thought on that?
So yeah, I think so based on kind of what we talked about today, I think that like password changes periodically is very important, given the fact that a lot of times if kind of passwords stay the same and they're not being changed periodically, kind of gives more time for the attacker to really try to kind of compromise these accounts, whether through like there's a mechanism that attackers can just try like a brute force way to kind of gain passwords to accounts. But on top of the changing periodically, I think it's very important to generate like quality passwords, in the sense where we're not sharing passwords between accounts. So kind of the periodically, kind of the time range in which you change passwords is very important, that you're constantly keeping your passwords updated. But at the same time, it's also very important to kind of create those quality passwords that are hard to guess.
Yeah, for sure. I think the reuse of the passwords is probably the more important part here, is that, you know, you want to change your passwords so you don't, you know, hackers don't get access to those, and, you know, they get access to those by usually breaching your personal accounts of individuals, and the individuals that reuse those passwords with the business accounts, they get access into them that way, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Got one more question here. Out of all of the research you did with the companies, what was the most used method of remediation, and what measures were put in place to help prevent future compromise?
So I think from kind of the research that we did, really the most used method of remediation was the fact that kind of when these accounts were flagged by Barracuda's detectors, Barracuda would really alert these companies and these IT teams that these accounts have been flagged, and they would kind of perform kind of an analysis and confirm that. So that was a big source of remediation, because of the fact that we saw it on Barracuda's end, and being able to kind of transfer that knowledge over to the IT teams to actually put a hold on these accounts and force the user really to change their password and kind of perform kind of this forensic analysis and cleaning. That was a big source of remediation that was put in place.
One more question. Is there a report that will show the severity of attacks which Barracuda protected the end users?
So I think that, from kind of this report, we didn't kind of study the kind of that angle for the question. I'm not sure, I don't know, Alicia, if you know that if there's any other reports that have been done already. But I know from kind of the point of view from this research, we wanted to really understand kind of the attackers at a high level on like how they're operating within these accounts, and really to understand kind of the main motives of attackers, to really inform kind of like future security strategies and future security mechanisms that can be employed to kind of prevent kind of these large numbers that we see where attackers are really spending large amounts of time in these accounts and really having different ways of compromising these accounts.
Yeah, at Barracuda, we publish different research reports on a regular basis, and many of them will look at the impact that these attacks are having on organizations and users within the organization. So this is a fourth volume of our spear phishing attacks, and the previous ones looked at other types of threats like business email compromise or spear phishing. In general, different types of spear phishing. We have also recently did the research on different types of email attacks, and we basically looked at email attacks ranging from spam and malware to business email compromise and account takeover, and we really dived into each of those threats and looked at the impact of the threats and types of protection you can put in place. So if you go on the Barracuda website, you'll be able to find a report called 13 email threat types, and that will give you some more ideas about different types of attacks and their severity. So we've got one more question here. How would you position Barracuda in the market against the existing incumbent or competitor? I think I can probably take that question. It probably depends very much on who we are comparing ourselves to. There's a number of things that Barracuda offers on for their other vendors in the market might not, and there are some, of course, some things that other vendors may offer that Barracuda has gaps in. But one of the main kind of differentiators that we have in the market today is, if I go back on a slide where we talk about our stack, we have various layers of protection, starting with the gateway through to API-based in-box defense, where we protect against those spear phishing attacks using artificial intelligence and layered with a security awareness training and then automated incident response. I mean, having all of those pieces, there's a lot of companies out there that offer each of those pieces individually, but as a package deal, Barracuda Total Email Protection, this is our main differentiator, is that you get all of those layers within the single package. I think I have one more question here. We have 2FA enabled for all users. Is that not enough to protect against account takeover?
So I think the kind of 2FA is very, very important for kind of offering kind of this really like security in depth kind of this approach where a user, even if kind of an attacker compromises kind of one angle, they compromise your password for maybe your initial login password, but if you have like 2FA enabled through like your phone, they would also need to kind of compromise your phone, for example. But we have seen a lot of incidents where, and this is pretty common, where an attacker will kind of launch one of these phishing attacks, and they will also kind of launch and create kind of fake web pages where that kind of display, where the user would typically kind of type in their 2FA code, or like if a code is being sent to their phone, they would type in this code on this web page, and the attacker would quickly kind of gain this information and then log in on behalf of the user. So 2FA is very, very important, but there are attacks that we have seen been leveraged that can kind of go around 2FA. But really at a high level, 2FA is a lot better than just having kind of a single sign-on with just one password. Alicia, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else to that.
Yeah, 2FA is definitely something that we recommend to all of our customers to enable as a way to secure your email. But we also always caution that this is not a silver bullet, and there are some ways the hackers are able to get past them. We've seen a number of attacks where, in addition to the one that Neil described, where they would create a fake app and insert a token inside the URL page, and so when an individual goes and logs in, provides their account details, tries to log into their account, they are logging in on a legitimate page, but what they're doing is not logging into their account. They're providing permissions for fraudulent app to have access to their email account. So as a result, hackers don't get access to the actual password and the actual login information, but they do get access to the account. So they completely bypass stealing passwords. And even if you change passwords, even if you use 2FA, that app that they have created, the fraudulent app has authority to kind of access email accounts, and therefore hackers have access to have ability to access email accounts. So there's unfortunately ways for them to get around it, but it's definitely something that you still want to have in place for sure. Yeah, I think we might have time for one more question. Are these attacks automated or manual?
Yeah, so during kind of our research, we saw that a lot of the attacks there's kind of a mix of attacks that are both automated or manual. So we saw a lot of the kind of the phishing attacks where attackers would send kind of phishing emails from a user's account. We actually saw that a lot of these showed signs of automation, in the sense where we would see kind of these large bursts of email with the same subject, kind of the same body, being sent at kind of really automated time. So like they would be sent kind of 1 minute right after each other to a kind of a different set of recipients, for example. So it appeared as if like the attacker was just cycling through kind of a list of contacts and just choosing a chunk of the contacts, sending an email, then sending the same email to kind of a next chunk of contacts, and so on. But for the most part, we also saw that there was a lot of attacks that were performed through manual means, and And kind of a big reason for that is likely that kind of a lot of the attackers may not have kind of the infrastructure needed to kind of perform these automated attacks. And these infrastructures cost a little bit more money. And also to kind of perform these manual attacks, there's a lot of ways that attackers can kind of employ kind of a cheaper labor to kind of go ahead and like monitor a user's account and perform a lot of these manual attacks. So kind of the big drawback from an attacker's perspective for automation is really the kind of setting up the infrastructure, which can take a good amount of time, and really the kind of the economic aspect of that. So that's why we kind of saw kind of a mix of automation and manual work.
Okay, thank you, Neil. I think these are all the questions that we had for today. So thank you, everyone, for taking time to join us, and hope you found this useful. Download the report if this is something that is interesting to you, and learn a little bit more about account takeover and how to protect against them. Thank you very much.